Taoiseach Leo Varadkar has said he profoundly disagrees with some of the language used by the Catholic Church when referring to gay men and women. His comments came as the country prepares for Pope Francis to visit this weekend. Well, joining me with that story and everything else this morning are Johnny Fallon from Carr Communications and Ellen Gunning, Director of the Irish Academy of Public Relations. Good morning to you both. The Taoiseach was everywhere yesterday, speaking to as many media outlets, I think, as he possibly could in advance of his meeting with the Pope this morning. And I think we've been waiting, the public have been waiting to see how was the Taoiseach going to handle this meeting with Pope Francis. What was he going to say as a leader of the Irish state? But it was interesting yesterday because I think at times you do forget that the Taoiseach himself is a gay man and he is sitting in front of the head of the Vatican, the religion that says that gay people are intrinsically disordered and being gay is contrary to natural law. And given what they say, he played it very well, actually. His language was still... It wasn't very inflammatory, was it?
His language was very carefully chosen. I thought his location was carefully chosen. He wasn't standing on the steps outside the Dáil, or he wasn't standing on the steps outside the department. He was sitting in a room with soft lighting behind him. The visuals looked reasonable and everything he said was very reasonable. And he spoke, when he was asked about gay people in the church, he said there were a number of people in the church who were uncomfortable. Who felt excluded, either about how women were treated, or because they were members of the LGBTI community, or because they had been divorced. So I thought he broadened it a bit. He didn't want to focus on him as a gay man. I thought he was very conscious of that. But his language was, I thought, very prime ministerial. He spoke about the fact that the Pope would be very welcome to Ireland. It was his job to welcome him. 750,000 people were expected to come out. So he put it in the context of a head of state greeting somebody who was the head of the Vatican state.
Because when we speak about language, we look at the Jesuit priest, Father James Martin from the United States, who was speaking yesterday at the World Meeting of Families in the RDS, and he said LGBTI, members of the LGBTI community have been treated like lepers. Now that is inflammatory language. You could really contrast the two approaches, couldn't you?
Completely. And what the Taoiseach did, I thought he was much more subtle, but I loved the message was just as strong. What struck me most was he said, and I saw one piece on television and one piece on radio, I'm not sure if they're both from the same interview. On television I saw him actually saying that what we learn about clerical child sexual abuse, we learn from the survivors and the advocates, not from the church. And I thought that was very powerful. And on radio I heard a piece where he said there is no statute of limitations on prosecuting child sex abusers. And I think he was being very clear in his challenge to the church.
Yes, and he has spoken about that this week, earlier this week, that he would like to see mandatory disclosure being brought in. Is that something that the Vatican should seek to implement across sort of the Catholic world as opposed to just in Ireland?
And he's talking about the Pope. In fairness, he said he appreciated the Pope's words, but the words need to be backed up with action.
And you mentioned and said something very interesting, I thought, Johnny, I was speaking to you just before we came back on air there. The state cannot be seen to attack the Pope because the state's own record in dealing with victims of clerical abuse and those who lived in the Magdalen laundries, and the list goes on, isn't exactly perfect, is it?
It's not, and that's the problem. I mean, this is a very tricky diplomatic mission, if you like, for the Taoiseach, because, you know, he does want to go and say certain things to him, and people have an expectation, and Kevin Doyle talks about this in the Independent Day. That expectation may not be easy to deliver on for people, because if you think back to when Enda Kenny made the famous speech about the Magdalen laundries, but that did come back to haunt him afterwards, because that government failed to deliver for many of the victims of the Magdalen laundries. And the state was very much involved in all of these things in the past, and the state's own record in various other things that it's doing is not good. So the problem for a Taoiseach, or any Taoiseach, when they're faced with that is that once you take up that job, you do take everything that goes with it. And if Leo Varadkar were to go very much on the offensive, it would be the easiest thing in the world for him to do, go up and score a few points against the Pope and say, well, there's laying out all that's wrong.
And you also have to be aware as the Taoiseach of the country that there's 750,000 people, not all of them Irish, but who are travelling to Dublin and to Knock to see the Pope.
And there would be a huge crowd out to see him. And of course, lots of people who still support, Catholicism in Ireland. So he'd be mindful of that. But then he's also mindful of the idea that, look, at the end of the day, the more he would go on the offensive, the more it would cause people to say, well, what is the Irish state doing about abuse? How much resources are given to the Gardaí to investigate it? What are we doing about cracking down on this internally within Ireland without ever talking to the Vatican? What have we done in Ireland? And that can open up big problems. So I think he has handled it well. I think he's decided to go for a very measured approach, and I think that's what he has to do. Unfortunately, I think the one difficulty with that is there will be hardline Catholics who will be offended at him saying anything about it at all. And on the other side, you have a lot of people with a liberal voice who'll say he didn't go far enough. And when you go that middle road, you end up sometimes satisfying nobody. But I think it's the only option
It's the
he's
safest
got.
thing. The Pope's handling of this issue is going to, I suppose, dominate international media coverage. All eyes are on Ireland this weekend. And how he confronts this issue, I think, will determine whether or not this visit is a success.
Yeah, and we've been getting really mixed messages. I mean, on the one hand, we're told that the Pope will meet with survivors of abuse. On the other hand, we're told that actually it will be a private meeting, which is absolutely right. But members of the LGBT community weren't allowed to take a stand at the World Meeting of Families. Visuals of same-sex couples were removed from brochures. At whose request, who knows? But the messages are very mixed. Archbishop Dermot Martin seemed to be suggesting at one stage earlier in the week almost that the Pope had a poor team around him, I'm paraphrasing him now, but that the team weren't doing him any favours. And I don't really know if that's good enough either. It's a worldwide story. I think the Pope really has to come out. I think he has said, we're sorry and we have sinned. We've seen all that contrition.
We want more.
I think now we need, this is criminal, and here's how we move it forward.
I just want to move on to another story that's in the papers and leading some of the papers this morning. The backstop arrangement. What are we going to do about the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland? It has been a particularly contentious issue. It seems to be the issue that is really holding up there being a deal between the UK and the EU. The new suggestion that seems to be coming from the EU, or at least it's being put out there as a new idea, a fresh idea, is that there will be checks on goods travelling from the United Kingdom to Northern Ireland, and those checks would take place on land in the UK. Now, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's anything particularly new about this, Johnny Fallon. We had this idea of there being a border down the Irish Sea as opposed to a border along the old-fashioned border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. They're trying to make this, I think, more politically palatable, aren't they? They're saying, look, it'll be run by private companies. They won't be wearing EU jackets and uniforms. You'll barely even know what's happening, lads. That's what the EU is saying. But how can Theresa May sign off on that? And more importantly, how can the DUP?
Yeah, and I think, as you say, this isn't particularly new. This has been there since day one. It's been said, where would you put a border if there's a hard Brexit? And it's been, well, you either put it around Northern Ireland, which will be impossible to really police, or you put it at the ports and airports. And there is this idea that we'll make it a bit more palatable. Let's put uniforms on people, could be privately operated. But the real problem here is that that's not going to be. That will cut off the DUP from Northern Ireland. It also presumes, as the EU want, that they are going to have the Northern Ireland within the customs union. Now, the truth is that in all of these solutions that we've come to, no more so than the Chequers Agreement, we now can see Theresa May cannot carry any of these politically. She can't even carry a no-deal Brexit politically, in my view, without causing an election. So no matter what this is heading towards at the moment, whether they get some kind of deal or no deal, it's heading towards an election in the UK and probably a second referendum on the whole topic in any event, because it's becoming unavoidable, because now every solution that's put forward hasn't moved on from where we were at the very start of the negotiation. So nobody really has achieved anything.
Doesn't it? I was hoping to get to Ellen the story in the front of the Irish Independent. Wine o'clock culture makes women here in Ireland the 7th biggest drinkers in the world, but we've run out of time. So you can have your glass of wine in peace this evening. I'm not feel guilty about it, Ellen. Ellen and Johnny, thanks so much for joining us this morning. I shouldn't joke. Plenty more to come on this programme back after the short break.